Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. Today, I am joined by Dr. Jen Thum. Jen is an Egyptologist, museum educator, and curator dedicated to making art and the ancient world more accessible to students and the public. Her recent books, Teaching Ancient Egypt in Museums, Pedagogies in Practice, and Be a Scribe, are both direct results of this dedication. She is Associate Director of Academic Engagement and Campus Partnerships and Research Curator at the Harvard Art Museums. She also serves as Vice President for Outreach and Education for the Archaeological Institute of America and teaches at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Jen is here today to talk to us about her work on object-centered learning and responsible stewardship of ancient Egyptian artifacts at the Harvard Art Museums. And there are several links to Jen's work, including a really great lecture and a fantastic free-to-download kids coloring book focused on ancient Egypt. So if any of those sound interesting to you, absolutely take a look at those links. Dr. Thum, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
It is going to be lots and lots of fun. Before we get into the Egyptological side of things, would you mind just introducing yourself and telling the audience how you became interested in the study of the ancient world?
Sure. So I work at the Harvard Art Museums, and my title doesn't really tell you very much about what I do. So to break it down, most of my work is in interdisciplinary teaching with the collections across our entire museum, and mostly at the university level. And I'm also a research curator, and my area of specialty is with the Egyptian objects in our care. But I wasn't one of those kids who grew up being especially interested in ancient Egypt. I was interested to the degree that your average kid is, but not exceptionally
like pyramids
so.
of fun and Tutankhamun.
Yeah, yeah. I knew about ancient Egyptian culture. I obviously studied it in school, and I was interested, but I wasn't crazed about it yet. And I actually discovered archaeology in college, so I think comparatively quite late. Discovered it by accident. I took an anthro course my first semester. I had no idea what I wanted to major in, and I really liked it. So I looked for the second semester for a course that was also an anthro that would fit in my schedule, and it happened to be Intro to Archaeology. So I took that course, and at one point the professor said something like, "Oh, if you guys don't have plans this summer, you can go on a dig." And I already really loved thinking about the possibility of archaeology as an actual career. It's not something that ever occurred to me that someone could really do, or the very different ways that you can be an archaeologist, that you can practice as a professional. So I went on a dig. It's really like the rest was history. I became an anthro major on an archaeology track. I did a study abroad at the excavations at Amheda when I was a junior. So it was my first time working in Egypt on an actual excavation project there. And I ended up writing a VA thesis on funerary portraits, which I think we're going to talk a little bit about today. And then I applied for lots of different programs. When I was applying to grad school, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to specialize in within archaeology. And I ended up becoming an Egyptologist because that is the program that I got funding for my master's. So I became an Egyptologist because I had the funding support, and then I did my PhD in archaeology.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And I have to say, I remember the first time someone told me that actually I could just go on a dig one summer if I wanted to do that. I was like, you let people do this? This is an option for me to do with my summer. It was quite mind-blowing. Okay, thank you for that. Now, what is your own personal area of specialization then?
So I like to say that I work at the delicious intersection of museum pedagogy and Egyptology. So this is such a great marriage of these two fields. So it means that I try to get people of all kinds, students and the public, interested in the ancient past. And I'm an expert in the teaching and learning methods that allow that to happen in general. But for my personal interests, it's specifically with artifacts. And my focus at the museum is interdisciplinary object-based learning. So like I said, that involves the whole collection, but it does often involve Egyptian objects and other ancient material culture. But it's using it in creative ways. So I'm not always talking explicitly about Egypt. For example, when I use Egyptian objects, I might be using them for other kinds of learning. And we could talk more about that later.
Oh, definitely. What sparked your personal interest in the kind of object-based learning side of things?
So I had no idea that museum education was a thing at all. I think it's sort of, I and many other people assumed in college that if you wanted to work in museums, you would be doing straight curatorial work. And I did a couple internships at the Metropolitan Museum of Art when I was in college. And for one of them, it was like a summer program, you had to give tours of the museum, public tours. And they were on a theme of your choice, and they had to go like cross collection. And when I started to give those tours, that's when I realized that I really liked talking to people about things. So that was, I think, what the initial spark came from. But then when I was in grad school, one of the things that you're required to do in the program that I did at Brown was this program called Think Like an Archaeologist. And I really encourage everyone to look this up because their resources are online, or they should be still online. They're always changing. They're really fantastic. It's basically a program for sixth graders. It's got visits to the classroom and visits to museums and other like cultural institutions where they learn critical thinking skills disguised as archaeology. So they learn like how to make maps and how to do like spatial reasoning and all these kinds of things. And the grad students in my program were required to teach that for a semester. And I loved it. And what I loved most about it was the object-based learning that I started weaving into it. So I did some of the work with them when they would visit the Rhode Island School of Design Museum, the RISD Museum, or I would bring like images of some of the artifacts that I've excavated myself into their classroom discussion. And I realized like this is something that I really enjoyed. And then fast forward to later in my degree, I worked at the RISD Museum as a K-12 educator while I was finishing my PhD. And I did some adult education things there as well. And that's where I really where I realized that I could do this with things that weren't just ancient as well. And I think the most fantastic thing about learning from images and objects is that anyone can do it. It works for so many different kinds of learner. And I find that it's especially powerful for kids because it's so different from what they're used to doing in school, which is like reading a text about something. But when you give them a chance to investigate an artifact, which is a primary source, especially when you get them to do that with open questions and you kind of let the conversation go wherever they take it, it gets them so engaged, and it can be really empowering for kids who might otherwise be more quiet in their classroom when they're talking about readings. Anyone can read an object. It doesn't require any specific skills or prior knowledge, and that's what I really love about it.
So, when you're doing this kind of work, how do you go about kind of helping modern people to understand more about the ancient people who would have used and interacted with them?
So my like general philosophy as an educator and a curator is to do two things. One is to use objects to talk about ancient people, not just about objects, right? I like stuff. Stuff is cool. I like to talk about stuff, but that's not what I'm trying to do. I want to use that stuff to center people. And in doing so, or the reason for doing so is to try to humanize and give personhood back to those people in the ways that I talk about them, because we often forget that there's a person behind the object. And the second thing that I try to do is what I call course correcting. For past practices that we would not do today in archaeology and museums, but where we have existing examples of those practices, like at our institutions, that we have to deal with. And I don't think we should be shying away from things that we wouldn't do anymore. So when I'm teaching, I'm trying to bring both of these things into the conversation. But I recognize that like most of the people who visit our museum, they're not going to do it with me. And they don't get like live interpretation, basically. So I think that the way that I can have the most impact on visitors is by taking the insights that I have from the conversations that I have with students in the public about these things in the gallery, and bring them out in the way that we curate those galleries. So I actually have like a couple examples to share, and I know I sent you some images for how I and my colleagues have done this very recently. So centering those ancient people and course correcting for past practices that we wouldn't do anymore. So the first one, and for anyone else who wants to bring this object up, if you're watching live or the recording, if you go to our website, harvardartmuseums.org/collections, you can type in the object number and you can have a look at what I'm talking about. The number is 1993.222. And that's half of it. So maybe, Megan, if you scroll down, you might get the image of the full, to the left. There we go. Awesome. Fun fact, I don't know if you know about this about museums, American museums, European museums, and several others, an object number, so 1993-222, usually that number before the period, that's the year the object came to the museum. So this was the 222nd object that came to our museum in 1993. So let's take a look at it. So the first thing to say, I guess as a preface to this object, is that we know that the Egyptians did not want their burials to be disturbed. And we know that they wanted to be remembered, and we know that they wanted to be remembered by name. It's part of giving them a beautiful afterlife, is keeping your name, your memory alive. And this object is on view now. It is the lintel, so the top part of the doorway, from the tomb of a man who lived during the Old Kingdom. His name was Ptahshepses Impi. Impi was his nickname. It's what his friends and family would have called him. So at the museums, we call him Impi. And you can see, I think, from this image now, it has a huge piece missing from the center. So the piece that is missing is most of a text that is a really common funerary text. It's a text that Egyptologists call the offering formula. It's the text that allows the deceased person to have what they need in the afterlife. So they would ask for a whole list of things, mostly sustenance, but also some other luxuries. So you always have like bread and beer, but they might say every good thing, linen, alabaster, things like that. And that is the piece that is missing. And if you were to look at this object in person and you had a look at the interior of that break, you would see saw marks on it. So we know that that middle was sawed out intentionally by a modern person. We don't know exactly when, and we don't know exactly why. One reason might be that if you split an object into 3 parts, you then have 3 objects to sell on the art market. It might also be that it was easier to move, and this was actually done by someone who was doing some kind of like pseudo archaeology. In any case, the middle is gone. We don't know where it is. And in the absence of that piece from this funerary object, we have 2 perspectives on this same ethical problem. So the first is this modern perspective, like that middle's missing. This is evidence of something we would not do today. It's really unfortunate because it robs us as visitors and researchers of knowing more about Impi and maybe more about offering formulae or something like that. So there's that perspective, but then there's also the ancient perspective, because this is a text that allows him to have what he needs in the afterlife. And that is what is gone. It's like robbing him of part of his beautiful afterlife. And it's a shame, really. So when I first came to the museums about 6 years ago, these 2 pieces were displayed really close together. So they were displayed with maybe like an inch between them. Oh, yeah, like that. I forgot that image was still there. So they're displayed like this. And I passed by, I must have gone into this gallery like my first week. And I had a look at it, and I immediately could tell, just because I know what the offering formula usually looks like, I could tell that there was definitely something missing that is more than just this little sliver. So this is like misleading to me, because it gave the impression, I felt, that like only a small chunk was missing. And then it also felt to me kind of like a cover up for this violence that had occurred toward this object, and this kind of unfortunate situation that we have for Impi himself. So very recently, so like just a year ago, so it took like 5 years to really think through this, and I have an article about this object as well, if you're interested in learning more. My colleague, Caitlin, who works with me here at the museums, she and I worked on a reinstallation of this object with the goal of doing those 2 things that I just talked about. So like underscoring the ancient personhood of the person, and also like course correcting for things we wouldn't do anymore. So we moved the pieces apart. Allah, yes, thank you for the beautiful illustration, Megan. We moved them apart as far as we could in the case. We put some dotted lines there, which I think you can see. The idea is to highlight that intentional break rather than obscuring it. That's course correcting. We're taking an object that has this unsavory story and we're telling people that story and we're showing them what happened to give them this like tangible example of why we wouldn't do this anymore. In addition to that, we put new labels on this object, but also the other Old Kingdom reliefs that are nearby. We put the English pronunciation of the names of the people these belong to, so Impi and others, in the labels so that people could learn their names and pronounce them, which I think is one very small way, but still a way of acknowledging that these are real people and giving them back some of their personhood. Also doing something along the lines of what they would have wanted. We know they didn't want these things to leave their tombs, but they did want to be remembered. And so we do have the ability to do that. And we also use the label to talk about the original context of the object, why it's here on its own, and how I figured out that actually there was a lot more missing. So this is because I did an epigraphic drawing basically, and I reconstructed what's the minimum that would have been missing from this offering formula. And then maybe most importantly for like just the questions that people tend to ask in museums of ancient objects today, we put the provenance line for this object in the label. So normally, actually, this is a great example. You can, if you scroll down, Megan, if you don't mind, there's a field, if you keep scrolling, that will say credit line. It's coming soon, I think. Oh, blah, blah, blah. That's fine. Credit line right there. So usually in a label in our museum and most others, you just get the credit line, which is like the last stop before it came to the museum. So is it a gift? Is it a bequest, which is something that a gift someone leaves in their will? Was it a purchase? Something like this. We decided that we wanted to tell people as much as we know ourselves about the whole trajectory of this object's life. And in this case, we don't know how it got into the hands of this dealer who eventually one of their relatives gifted it to us. But we wanted people to know as much as we do. And so most museums don't put the whole provenance line. If you scroll up, you'll see the provenance line is somewhere in there. There it is. They don't put it in the label. And the way it normally looks is just like that. It's like these strings of text separated by semicolons. And it's actually really hard to parse. So instead of also just like leaving it that way in the label, we made a narrative out of it. So we started doing this in all of the labels in the Egyptian gallery, and we'll do it in other ones as well because we're working on redoing our ancient galleries now. We're giving people an actual narrative about the life of the object that they can follow, and so that they can actually understand it, and then they can ask better questions, but also just have as much information as possible about how this got here. So the idea with all of this, the way we've reinstalled this object, is that now when you come to our museum and you look at it, you immediately understand, or we hope you immediately understand, that a huge piece is missing, right? Like I used to have people come up to this and it's like they were afraid to tell me it was broken. Like they would, it was like whispers, like, should we tell her? Now they come up to it and they, yeah, it's like, well, Megan, we're so used to seeing ancient objects in like knocked about shape, right? Like they're not perfect because they're so old. So, we just ignore those things. Now they come up to it and they're like, why is there a hole in the middle? And I'm like, bingo, this is the question that I want us to discuss. So we hope that you'll understand that a huge piece is missing. You wonder why. You get an answer that's kind of shocking, and hopefully you feel almost like a sense of loss for us as a learning institution, but hopefully more also for Impy as the person who needed that offering formula for his afterlife. And you come away with some of the tools to think about him and other ancient people as real people, and not so different from us. And hopefully that extends to how you think about other ancient people in other museums. And I have another example I want to share with you, but I want to give you a second if you had any thing you wanted to say about this, or ask me about this before I give another example.
I did want to ask if you'd had any feedback from visitors about how you've changed the display of the lintel, and if it has prompted the questions that you were hoping it would.
This is such a great question, because I feel, as I hope all museum workers do, that we should never do things that aren't evidence-based. And like, we don't want to prescribe things that we think people need in museums. We should be responding to needs and questions from the community. So I have, anecdotal evidence from how it feels for students to talk about this before and after the change for the same classes, different students, but across the years. And they immediately get it. And the conversations seem to be like much more directed about provenance, about the duty of care in the museum. So in that respect, it's been very successful. But the other thing that was a little different about this project to do this reinstallation is that I actually did a public program with this object where I surveyed people about what we should do. So I told them, like, here's all the other new information that we know from my research of this object. There's a lot of stuff I didn't get into about, like, we used to think it belonged to someone else's tomb. We were wrong. So I asked them, like, well, now that you know what has, like, a little bit more about this object's history, like, what should we do to talk about that story? Like, how do we surface that in the galleries? And I gave them, it was on Zoom, it was live. I gave them a poll, and the majority of people said that they wanted us to separate the pieces as part of that narrative. So it was in response to that event. And then I had some grad students think about this with me as well, in a sort of gallery experience that I did with a colleague of mine at our Center for Teaching and Learning. So all of that kind of led to that decision. But I never want to do things that, like, don't have a new impact or that maybe are harmful. And so I'm always looking for that feedback, and I hope that I'll get more of it.
Awesome, thank you.
That's a great question.
Now, do you want to start with the portrait of a woman?
Yeah, I'll show you another example of this. So I thought this is a great example because it's brand new. Like, literally, these were installed 2 weeks ago. So it's two portraits. I'll talk about this one first. So both of them are funerary portraits. And if you're watching live, or if you're coming back to this and you can't see on the screen, the number of this one is 1923-60. The other one is 1924-80. And these are two funerary portraits from the period when Egypt was under Roman rule. So each of these paintings was designed as part of the funerary equipment of the person they depict, and they would have been placed over their face. So their body is mummified. The face is also wrapped, and then the portrait goes over the face and it's kind of wrapped into the wrapping. So you get it as sort of like a window in the wrappings above their face, where it shows sometimes a quite realistic looking, or a very detailed portrait of their face. But at most museums, including ours, only the portraits remain in our care. So the bodies are long gone. And the people who brought these objects out of Egypt, in this case, around 100 years ago, but this applies kind of across the board, they were basically really only interested in the portrait alone, either as a curiosity or because they wanted to treat this ancient portrait like a European portrait with this sort of through line they're trying to make to European culture, which is kind of whitewashy and problematic for a lot of reasons. Or practically, it's easier to bring a portrait out of Egypt than it is to bring an entire body out of Egypt. And it's not obvious to most visitors that there ever was a body, because usually when these portraits are displayed in museums, there's like around 1,000 of them in museums around the world today. They're usually displayed vertically against a wall, like a European portrait, like a portrait that was always meant to hang on a wall, like art, like capital A art. So what we just did with these, like literally 2 weeks ago, is we put them back on view. These two had not been on view for a little while. And we chose to display this portrait of a woman in the round, because when you see the back of it, and actually I think there is a picture of the back, I realize in the web record, this is just a piece of the back, but you can see what I'm talking about. When you see the back of it, you can see that there are still pieces of linen stuck to the back and the sides. And that is this really visceral reminder of this violent act that separated the portrait from the body, and also a reminder that there was a body. It's not just that this person is undergoing the disrespect of having their burial disturbed. and their body removed from the tomb. It's also that their body is separated from this thing that they need for their burial. It's desecrated in this way. And it also like implies that the artist's work, the ancient artist's work, is valued more than their funerary wishes and more than their personhood by the modern person who did this. And so, like, long story short, this gives people a chance to see that and react to it and actually realize that there is an absent body that is implicated in this practice. The other portrait, if you don't mind clicking on that, Megan. So the other one is same period-ish. It's a portrait of a man, 1924-80. So it came to the museums 100 years ago in 1924. That one is, we displayed it horizontally because this is a way of gesturing to the fact that someone would be laying down in their tomb. So it's another departure from what you'd normally do in a museum. But I put this one on view because it's actually cobbled together from multiple ancient portraits of men by a modern person who was attempting, or people, I don't know, they were attempting to make it look like a portrait of one man. So we think what happened is they had like a kind of thinner, sort of the center of this portrait is like the original portrait, a thinner portrait that wasn't complete. And they thought it would be easier to sell on the market if they made it look more complete. And it's crazy because they didn't fill this in with modern pieces. They did it with pieces of other ancient portraits. We know that because my amazing colleagues in conservation and conservation science have done a lot of analysis on this work, and they know that the pieces are ancient for various reasons, which I'm happy to get into the questions if you want. So we wanted to have like people recognize that, because it's also like, oh my God, this isn't even an individual anymore that's being presented to us. Like, this is another kind of disrespect. And so basically the new labels that I wrote for these say all of those things about them that I just said. The labels are not really about Roman Egypt. So if you come to our museum and you're expecting to learn a ton about Roman Egypt by looking at these, that's probably not what's going to happen. Instead, they're about the art market. They're about the effects that it's had on museum collections, and they're about our institutional responsibility in stewarding these funerary objects.
That is really, really interesting.
I feel so bad for him. Like,
I do. And you have to wonder what happened to the rest of the other pieces. Is it?
Yeah. You know, like the crazy thing about this one is that they line up so well, the pieces that were used from other portraits. And that implies that they're similar in style, which implies that they're from the same local area, but also probably the same cemetery, which means that someone might have been doing this like on site, or like they had access. Like, who has access to all these ancient portraits to be able to do this? And that's like a whole other like can of worms. It's like a really disturbing possibility.
Wow. That is really interesting. Thank you for both kind of illuminating that for the museum goers and also for people like me. Like, I have some knowledge of ancient Egypt, but like no idea about these specific kinds of problems, previous issues. Interesting.
And they're in so many museums, Megan. Like, most major museums with Egyptian collections have funerary portraits in their care, and it's something that like we can all be dealing with in different ways. So it's like a really widespread problem.
Do you see a shift in museum curatorship more widely to addressing these issues, or is this kind of a you an outlier?
No, I do really think that a lot of people are thinking about these things really critically. Oh gosh, there was a great webinar. It's recorded, it's online. It was from, now I can't remember. It was like an interview with contemporary Egyptian people thinking about, it was called something like Their Mummies, Our Ancestors, where there's this whole conversation about this topic and others. And there's even been like changes to the language for the way that we talk about ancient Egyptian people whose bodies are in museums. So many of us don't say mummy anymore. We say mummified person or mummified individual, and that's like a field-wide change. And there are others as well. So like I think it's really something that a lot of us are thinking about. Definitely not unique to our museum, even though I think this is the first time that we staff at our museum right now have thought about these things in this way. They've been dealt with in lots of other ways in our collection before. So.
Well, thank you. We've got a little bit of time left. I wanted to try and get to as many of the questions as possible, because that was really fascinating, but there's a whole other variety of fascinating things that you do with your time and expertise. So I wanted to try and fit as much in as I possibly can. Could you talk to us about how you use the museum's collection in your teaching? And I'm asking specifically about your Care in Critical Times course, because that sounds amazing.
Yeah, so I'm using things from the collection, like across the collection, to talk to students in courses across the university. So they're usually other people's classes that are coming to think about objects as a primary source or another case study on the theme of their class in a different way. So for example, I might use like photographs of flooded landscapes or Dutch prints that show different like irrigation techniques for courses that focus on like the environment. That's like one example. The course that you asked about is taught by a friend of mine, actually, Andy Wright. She's an anthropologist. She teaches this course called Care in Critical Times. And I just used the lintel from Impey's tomb that I just talked about with her class as one of like a series of different case studies on this theme of care. So that was kind of an easy one because that object, as a funerary object, as an object that had some of an offering formula for students to see, it's about the ancient responsibility of caring for the dead and the upkeep of your funerary cult. But it also has this whole story to tell about the museum's duty of care. So for all the reasons that I just said. So we had a discussion starting off with that object. I never assume that students know anything about Egyptian art before we talk about it. So I start just with kind of what they see, and we kind of get to the ancient care implicated in that object and the museum's duty of care as we go. But for the same class, I used two works of contemporary art as well. I used a series, actually a colleague of mine taught for that part, a series of photos of unhoused people in a Boston shelter. And then also a monumental print series that is showing an artist balancing their job as an artist and their job as a mother and work-life balance. And so we get these different kind of angles on what care means, and those come out in the course of the visit. And when I can use Egyptian art or ancient art as even just a small piece of one of those conversations for these very interdisciplinary classes, that is like the magic sauce. It's what I try to do every time.
Now, could you talk a little about teaching radiology residents? How on earth does that? I'm a huge fan of interdisciplinary work. This is just absolutely up my field. But how on earth do you meet radiology residents and Egyptology? Like, what happens there?
Yeah. So what you're asking about is I literally just taught the last session for this year. Like it ended at 12 o'clock. It ended 30 minutes ago, or I guess an hour ago. So this is very fresh in my mind. So what you're talking about is this program that is definitely one of the weirder things that I do. It's a partnership with a radiology professor named Haewon Hyun. It actually came about because she wanted us to design a program for her residents. So this is the 6th year that we just completed of this program. It's a year-long program. They come to the museums 5 times, and then they have 2 virtual sessions with me also. It's under this umbrella called Medical Humanities, which is basically a discipline that considers the human aspects of medical practice. And of course, medicine is so human. Like it's about people and the care of people. So for this program, Seeing in Art Medical Imaging, we have the residents come and use artworks to dig into some of the aspects that involve human relationships of their work. So the art is like a conversation starter, basically. And I have done this, I think, with probably every part of our collection now. I've hit like, at least one object from every part of it. But I think that ancient art, especially ancient funerary objects, not just Egyptian ones, but across the board, are an especially good match for this program. And the reason has to do with the particular situation among all physicians of being a radiologist. So if you've ever had like an x-ray or a CAT scan, if you've ever broken a bone, you probably never met your radiologist. The lights just went off in my office. Let me wave my hand around a bunch and see if I can. All right. So you probably never met your radiologist. You probably had whatever their verdict was about your images relayed to you through your own physician. So they have this unique challenge among physicians, which is that they don't usually meet their patients. They only do it like maybe 20% of the time, they tell us. So they're used to understanding what's going on with you and getting to know you by looking at images of you and your medical history, basically, those two things, and then like, giving their verdict to someone else. So they have this challenge to try to connect with and remember and empathize with this person who they're never going to meet. And that is really similar to the challenge of anyone who engages with ancient art, not just people who are curating ancient art or teaching with ancient art, but also visitors. There's also a person behind the image who you're never going to meet. And this is like one of those human aspects of our practice in museums too. I think we often, like, what I find so bizarre is like we walk past curators, educators, visitors, we walk past funerary objects in museums all the time as if that's completely normal. And I do not think that it is normal. I think we've been desensitized to the fact that those are funerary objects, that there's a real person implied. Some of them are urns that are empty. Like, it's not normal. We're desensitized to it. So we often forget that those people are people. So I'm really interested in this shared challenge of remembering and empathizing with that person on the other side of the image. And Heywan and I are actually working on an essay about this right now. It's going to be in an edited volume that I'm working on with my colleagues Carl, Lisa, and Lizette. It's about teaching about the ancient world in museums. It's our second volume together. So there'll be an essay about that soon. If we have to find the time to sit down and write it, but it's like really been top of mind for me with this shared challenge that we have.
Amazing. Thank you. I have to give a very brief shout out to Dr. Carl Walsh, who is listening as we speak, in provenance information for his gallery as he talks to the listeners. So, hey, Carl.
Hi, Carl. Yeah. So, well, thank you also for being here, Carl. Fantastic colleague to work with on that edited volume and many other projects.
Well, thank you, Jen, for answering my questions. We have a couple of audience questions that we'll get to before I let you go and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. First, can you share insights on how recent technological advancements, such as digital imaging and 3D modeling, have transformed the study and preservation of Egyptian artifacts and sites?
Ooh, this is a great question. We actually haven't done very much with 3D modeling or printing with the collections here. One thing that's really been a huge project is to digitize like just the high-res images of all of our collections. So almost all of it is on the website. But I can tell you how those things have shaped the field of Egyptology in different ways. And one of them is activism in thinking about repatriation. So there have been multiple different attempts to use 3D printing of objects that Egypt would like back, for example, the Nefertiti bust, as a way of like sharing that image around. And I think some of it is an attempt to decenter the original object, which is in Berlin and Egypt would like back, to sort of make it's like an equity project, basically, to share that data, the image around, so that anyone can sort of own it. I think it's like a protest action, actually, because if Egypt is not able to get that object back from Berlin, then one of the ways to allow better access is through a 3D print, something like that. They've also been used to for accessibility teaching. So I have a colleague named Fatma Soliman at the GEM, the New Grand Egyptian Museum, that is sort of partway open right now. I was just there a couple weeks ago with her. She's the head of accessibility there. and she is using 3D prints, actually not to scale, but scaled down, of architecture and also artifacts as touchables for low vision visitors. And there's actually an essay about this in our first volume, Teaching Ancient Egypt in Museums. It's a really fantastic way to use technology to give greater access to people. So 2 different ways to use that technology for access. That answers your question.
Thank you very much. JC asks, could you comment on whether Aktaron, saffron, and Akhtar, help or assist, are potentially etymologically related? If the answer is no, that is absolutely fine. I'm assuming we're talking ancient Egyptian, but I don't really know.
I don't know either. So questions like this, where you have 2 words that may or may not be related, this is something that you would want to spend quite a bit of time thinking about. So this is not a relationship that I've thought about before. I don't think, even if I had an inkling, I wouldn't want to give you an exact answer now either. But that's kind of interesting because saffron, if it's used for medicinal purposes, you could see how that would have an etymological relationship. It's possible. There are other cases like that in Egyptian language and others. So,
yeah, etymology is always a bit of a unfortunately requires a lot of research to make sure you're not like, I mean, they sound the same, they have similar semantic ranges. Yeah, sure. But actually, you find out, no, they're really, really not. So the answer is we don't know, and we're very sorry. Final question before we wrap up for the day. How do you work with students outside of the gallery?
Yeah, this is a great question. So one of the projects that I think I'm most proud of that I've done recently is a collaboration with some teachers at a local middle school. So as I said, most of my job is working at the university level in our museum. That's just because this is sort of like our primary audience. Although I have a fellow working with me, his name is Sarah, who's really interested in younger visitors. And so she's doing a lot of experimentation in that area. But I've been working with this group of middle school teachers. They teach 6th grade social studies, and I go to their classroom every year now. And I do the same kind of object-based learning and have the same kinds of conversations that I would have in the gallery, but because they can't come and visit us for various reasons, I do it with images of the collection. And I really carefully select the ones that I use so that I know that they're like legible on a screen. And we're able to have the same or very similar conversations about the artifacts that way. But I also come and talk about my job and how did I get interested, and it basically serves as like an open Q&A session. And related to that, it's quite similar to what I do with another way that I talk to students outside of the museum galleries, which is Skype a Scientist. So if you're not familiar with Skype a Scientist, it doesn't usually actually happen on Skype. This is a great resource for matching people who have any kind of interest in any kind of broad science field. So that includes museum practice and archaeology, but also all the other kinds of science. For matching people who have interest, so that's students, teachers with whole classrooms, community venues, even individual learners at home, with an expert. And you use some kind of online platform to have a conversation. So I do Q&A usually, but I also start kind of similarly by getting them to dig into an object. And I like to use objects that are about normal people, or like if they're at least elites, they're not royal. So I like to use objects where I immediately upend the assumption that the most important people to think about are royal, or that everybody who's, objects are in museums are royal. That's actually not true. Many of them are, but not all of them. So I like to upend that assumption in that way. And also to try to choose objects that get them thinking about their own contemporary relationships to ancient people. We have some of the same concerns and some of the same things that we think about that people thought about thousands of years ago. And so to create that through line through the objects that I choose. So just a couple of examples.
We got a modern children's adaptation of the Epic of Gilgamesh for our. She's now 11. She was a couple of years younger. And that was actually one of the things that she really picked up on reading it, was this is such an old story, but they're worrying about things that we worry about. It's like, yeah, people are people throughout thousands of years. It's really, I think it's a really valuable lesson.
Yeah. Yeah. And it just goes back to that like humanizing, you know, that's really what it's about. So.
Well, Jen, I'm going to wrap up and let you go. Thank you so much for talking to us. This was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. Audience, thank you all so much for watching. I don't have anything on the books for the coming months. It is the summer. I have all of my children at home, which is chaotic to say the least. But keep your eye on the channel. If there are more interviews coming up, I will definitely let you all know. Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/Digital Hammurabi to see how you can help.